The silence of a child is a muffled scream that echoes within the soul of a parent. Sometimes there is no argument, no harsh words, not even a goodbye. There's just time passing, and with it, absence. You wait for a phone call that never comes, a hug that no longer arrives, and you begin to wonder, did I do something wrong? Have I stopped being important? No. What you're feeling isn't unimportance. It's discontinuity, and it wounds as if your very existence is being erased from the emotional map of the person you once cradled in your arms. Freud once said that the greatest human conflict is the one between the desire to be loved and the fear of rejection. In old age, that conflict grows louder. You've already offered your lap, your bread, your strength. Now, in the face of subtle abandonment, of postponed visits and forgotten calls, what remains is a void that can't be seen from the outside, but devours you from within. And in this moment, you don't need more advice. You need emotional clarity. And that begins with a truth no one dares to say. Sometimes children don't come back because they were never taught how to stay. But what about you? Will you let their absence define the worth of your existence? Will you allow their silence to write the narrative of your old age? Or will you finally do what Freud called sublimation? Transform raw pain into creative power, into a reinvention of self, into psychic liberation, because life, and even in its final chapters, is still fertile ground for profound rebirth. And what seems like abandonment today might actually be your invitation to rediscover who you are, beyond the role of parent. The human mind is shaped by attachment, and few attachments run as deep as the one between parent and child. But Freud taught us that suffering arises when we try to relive the past as if it were still alive. The secret, then, is not to forget the children you raised, but to remember who you are, regardless of how they treat you now. You don't have to be the forgotten hero of someone else's story. You can be the protagonist of your own, where wisdom replaces need and self-love takes the place of waiting. So if the phone is silent today, if the door doesn't open and the footsteps you long to hear don't approach and breathe, this is not the end, it is the turning point. And what you choose to do next can forever change the way you see yourself. And maybe, just maybe, the way they'll one day remember you. Because in this chapter of life, it's not just about being visited. It's about being respected, valued, and, above all, understood by the one person who matters most, yourself. They say time heals all wounds, but some silences deepen instead of fading. There comes a stage in life when the once noisy house grows quiet, not because you sought peace, but because those you raised have drifted away. The phone rings less often, birthdays pass unnoticed, and a quiet ache settles in your chest, a feeling not of loneliness, but of being emotionally exiled. This isn't just about absence, it's about the haunting question Freud explored relentlessly. How does one cope when the love we once gave becomes invisible? To Freud, the human psyche is driven by desires for connection, for recognition, for emotional reciprocity. In old age, these desires do not vanish. They become sharper, more desperate, more poignant. And when they are unmet, when the children you nurtured seem to vanish into their own lives, the result isn't just sadness. It's psychic pain, a pain that stems from the fracture between expectation and reality. You hoped for gratitude, presence, maybe even reverence. What you received was silence, and that silence cuts deeper than words ever could. But here's where the transformation begins. Freud taught us that the mature ego does not crumble under unmet desire. It adapts. It reinterprets the wound. You are not merely a parent awaiting affection. You are still a self, a soul with depths and dreams beyond the role you once played. When your child doesn't call, the wound is real, but it does not define your worth. It reveals your unmet need. And the wise thing to do is not to chase what withdraws, but to turn inward and ask, who am I now, without the gaze of my children? There is power in the pause. Freud believed that true liberation begins when we confront our internal conflicts instead of projecting them outward. Perhaps the absence of your children isn't about their neglect, but about your unconscious clinging. Clinging to an identity built on being needed, being missed, being central. But life, as Freud insisted, is a dance between letting go and holding on. And in this phase, maybe it's time to hold on to yourself. Not to the version of you they once knew, but to the version you are still becoming. The ego resists change because it fears annihilation. It tells you, if they stop calling, I cease to matter. But that is a lie born from fear. The truth is, you matter precisely because you exist, not because someone remembers to prove it. Your soul is not a voicemail waiting to be heard. It is a symphony that plays whether or not anyone listens. And perhaps this chapter of your life isn't about being visited, but about visiting parts of yourself long abandoned. The child you raised may be gone for now, but the child within you, still waiting to be found. There is a strange paradox in aging. As your body slows, your emotions deepen. The same arms that once lifted children now tremble when pouring tea. But the heart remembers everything. Every scraped knee you kissed, every late-night worry, every quiet prayer whispered over a sleeping child. And yet, what the mind struggles with is not the past, but the dissonance between what was given and what is received. Freud would say this is the moment when the unconscious cries out for resolution, for significance, for love that doesn't expire. To Freud, human behavior is often a repetition of old emotional patterns. When a child stops calling, the elderly parent may unconsciously relive earlier abandonments, the father who was too busy, the mother who was distant, the friend who forgot. These buried wounds resurface, disguised as present-day pain, and without realizing it, you start interpreting your child's silence as confirmation of your deepest fear, that you are forgettable. But this is not reality. It is emotional residue, and it is within your power to cleanse it. Transformation begins when you recognize the difference between emotional truth and factual truth. The emotional truth may scream, "They've left me because I no longer matter." But the factual truth might be simpler. They are consumed by their own lives, unaware of the shadows they cast. Freud called this projection, the act of placing inner fears onto others. By reclaiming those projections, you gain clarity. You stop making their absence a judgment of your worth and start viewing it as a mirror reflecting your need for healing. In that healing lies a quiet revolution. No longer are you merely a parent on standby. You become the analyst of your own soul. You observe the patterns, the longings, the assumptions, and slowly you begin to detach, not in bitterness, but in wisdom. Detachment to Freud was not coldness, it was strength. The ability to feel without collapsing, to long without begging, to care without demanding. This is the secret path of psychic maturity, and it begins the moment you stop waiting and start living. Because when you stop needing them to come back in order to feel whole, something unexpected happens. You begin to feel whole anyway, not because they changed, but because you did. Because you remembered that your identity was never meant to be built solely on their love, but on your capacity to love, to grow, and to find meaning, even in the silence. This is not resignation, it is rebirth, and it is available to you right now in the quiet of this very moment. What if their absence isn't the problem, but the invitation? An invitation to turn inward, to examine not just what you've lost, but what you've neglected within yourself. Freud saw suffering not as punishment, but as a compass pointing toward unresolved truths. So ask yourself, why does this silence hurt so much? Is it because of what they took, or because of what you forgot to give yourself? In the silence of their absence, your unconscious speaks. It whispers of the parts of you that were silenced long ago. The artist who stopped painting when diapers arrived, the philosopher who hid his thoughts behind grocery lists, the traveler who folded maps in exchange for routines. Their departure exposes the void, but it also reveals the neglected self. And now, in this space they've left behind, you are free to hear that inner voice again. Freud believed the unconscious never sleeps. It stores every forgotten dream, every repressed desire, every unlived life. And if you listen closely, you will begin to sense that your pain is not simply about missing them. It is about missing you. The you before duty, the you before sacrifice, the you before parenting consumed your identity. And this realization is not sorrowful, it is sacred. because now you have a chance to meet that version of yourself again. Imagine, just for a moment, that the phone never rings again. Imagine they never knock at your door. What remains? If the answer is silence, let it not be emptiness, let it be space. Space to create, to reflect, to become. Because what Freud understood, more than most, is that true freedom is not found in the presence of others, but in the reconciliation with yourself. The ego clings to roles. The soul seeks wholeness. So do not wait for their return to reclaim your joy. Begin now. Begin in the garden with your hands in the soil. Begin with books, with memories, with friends you haven't yet met. Begin with laughter, your own. And if tears come, let them be not of longing but of rediscovery. Because the life you feared was ending may, in truth, just be beginning. And that is the wisdom only age can offer. There's a temptation when abandoned to become the martyr, to tell yourself stories of how much you gave, how little you received, and how unjust the world has been. But Freud warned against this. He saw victimhood as a defense mechanism, a shield the ego creates to avoid confronting its own part in the dynamic. You were not just the giver, you were also the one who needed to be needed. And now when no one needs you, who are you willing to become? This isn't about guilt, it's about power. The power to stop living in narratives that shrink you. Freud believed that what we do not make conscious, we are doomed to repeat. And if your sense of value remains tethered to being remembered, you will remain trapped in cycles of disappointment. But when you break that chain, when you say, "I exist beyond their approval," something ancient within you awakens. You stop waiting to be seen, and you begin to see yourself. The tragedy of aging is not the loss of beauty or speed. It is the belief that you are no longer relevant. But relevance is not a gift bestowed by others. It is a declaration you make each morning, a decision to rise, to speak, to live. Freud knew that the psyche longs for expression. So express. Write the letter you never sent. Plant the garden they never cared to admire. Paint, sing, dance, not for them but for you. Because you were never just a parent, you were always an entire universe. And in the moments when sorrow knocks again, as it surely will, do not resist it. Invite it in. Freud taught that repressing pain only gives it power. But when you name it, when you say "this hurts," and you reclaim your authorship over it, you become the narrator, not the victim, the healer, not the haunted. This is the quiet revolution of the soul, and it does not require your children's return, only your own. So if the phone stays silent today, smile anyway, not in denial, but in defiance. You are not waiting for anyone. You are becoming someone, again. And that is a kind of joy no one can give or take away. Love that is conditional is not love, no, it is transaction. And perhaps what you offered your children was love so unconditional, so consuming, that they forgot it had a source that now runs dry. Freud would call this emotional misplacement, when we invest everything in another, believing it will return in kind. But when it doesn't, we're left bankrupt. And yet, within that bankruptcy lies the seed of rebirth. Because when you finally stop pouring from an empty cup, you are forced to refill it, not with their affection, but with your essence. Freud taught that the libido, the psychic energy of the soul, never disappears. It only redirects, and if you choose, you can redirect yours inward. Not into self-pity, but into self-creation, into hobbies, relationships, discoveries, into passions you buried beneath the weight of parenthood. You can begin again, not because they returned, but because you did. The danger of living for others is that you forget how to live for yourself. And when those others grow distant, you are left with a haunting silence. But in that silence lies possibility. Freud believed that within every symptom is a message. So what is your longing trying to tell you? Perhaps that it is time to reclaim your time, to reclaim your voice, to stop waiting to be called, and to start calling yourself into the life you've delayed for far too long. You are not unfinished business. You are not leftovers from someone else's story. You are a chapter still being written, with hands that still tremble, yes, but with a heart that still burns. So burn brightly, Not in anger, not in sadness, but in defiance of invisibility, because you were not meant to fade quietly. You were meant to blaze with the wisdom that only comes from surviving every storm and still standing. Let this be the turning point. Not when they return, but when you rise. Not when they remember, but when you do. Because the greatest homecoming is the one where you welcome yourself back, and that journey, it begins now. Memory is not simply a collection of moments, it is the architecture of identity. You remember their first steps, their laughter in the hallway, their small hands reaching for yours, but the more you remember, the more you ache. Because memory, Freud taught, is a double-edged sword. It comforts and it wounds. It gives meaning, yet it also exposes what is no longer present. And when your children vanish into their own timelines, you are left navigating a home where every corner whispers of their absence. But perhaps this ache isn't a punishment. Perhaps it is the echo of something sacred, your capacity to love so deeply, so completely, that even time cannot sever the bond. Freud believed that the past lives in us not as a ghost, but as a force shaping our choices. So what if you used these memories not to mourn, but to rebuild? What if, instead of waiting at the door, you opened another one, inward? To walk through it would be to meet not your child, but yourself. There is no shame in missing someone. The shame lies in letting that absence devour your identity. You are not a forgotten parent. You are a living archive of love, of wisdom, of resilience. And while they may have stepped away, you still carry the full weight of your story. Freud saw the self as a battlefield. Ego, superego, id, all pulling in different directions. But peace comes when you choose presence over expectation. When you decide that your soul deserves attention, even if no one else is giving it. There will be moments when you're tempted to reach out, not out of connection, but out of desperation. Freud would caution against this, because need, when unacknowledged, can masquerade as affection. Ask yourself, are you seeking closeness or validation? If it's the latter, pause, breathe, recenter. You do not need to be validated to be valuable. You are already whole. And wholeness is not given by others, it is cultivated within. So if today the living room is silent, if your phone remains untouched, light a candle. Not for them, for you. Let it burn as a symbol, a reminder that even in solitude, you still shine, that your presence still matters, that your story is not over. Because when you choose to stand fully in your own light, something remarkable happens. You stop chasing their presence, and they begin to feel your absence in a way they never did before. You were never meant to be their shadow. You were meant to be their sun. And yet over the years you shrank, not out of weakness but out of love. You made yourself small so they could grow. You dimmed your light so they could shine. But Freud warned us, repression comes at a cost. When we silence parts of ourselves for too long, they return, not as whispers but as screams. What you feel now is not just abandonment, it is accumulated silence, years of unmet needs, moments when you smiled though your heart was breaking. And now that they no longer need you in the ways they once did, the question echoes, who are you without their dependence? This, Freud would say, is the return of the repressed, not in the form of pathology, but in the form of potential. You are not unraveling. You are resurfacing. There is beauty in this stage of life, a raw, unfiltered beauty. You no longer need to impress, no longer need to perform. The masks fall away, the soul becomes visible. And in that visibility, you find a new kind of freedom, one that comes not from being needed, but from being true. True to your thoughts, your feelings, your desires. Freud believed that authenticity is the path to psychic health, and now, more than ever, it is time to be honest and with yourself. Yes, their absence stings, but deeper still is the invitation it offers, to reclaim the parts of you that were forgotten in the act of giving. You are not too old to dream, not too late to begin, not too far gone to feel wonder. You have within you the same drive Freud spoke of, the life instinct, the eros, and it is calling, not for them to return, but for you to arise. So rise. Write a letter, not to your children, but to the self you abandoned. Say everything you never dared, apologize if you must, forgive if you can, but above all, begin again. Because your life, just as it is, still holds stories untold. And they do not require an audience, only your courage to tell them. There comes a moment in every soul's journey when illusions fall away. The illusion that others will always stay. The illusion that love guarantees reciprocity. The illusion that your value depends on someone else's recognition. Freud believed that the mature mind does not run from disillusionment. It transforms through it. What feels like betrayal may actually be clarity. What feels like an ending may actually be truth breaking through. To mature, in Freud's view, is to accept life as it is, not as you hoped it would be. And yet acceptance is not passivity. It is the most powerful form of liberation, because when you stop expecting them to be what they cannot, you start becoming what you always were, whole, capable, radiant. This is not detachment in the cold sense. It is warmth turned inward, a redirection of love, a turning of the heart toward its original owner, you. In this space, you begin to find pleasure again, not in grand things, but in the subtle, the warmth of morning sun, the curve of steam from your coffee, the texture of a page beneath your fingers. Freud called this the return to primary processes, where joy is found in sensation, not validation. You begin to live from within, not in reaction to who is absent, but in celebration of what is present. And this shift is not small. It is seismic. There will be those who never understand this journey, who say, "But they're your children. You should keep waiting." But Freud would challenge that. He would ask, at what cost, if your identity remains forever hinged on the actions of others, are you truly free? The answer is no. Freedom comes when you no longer outsource your joy, when you no longer require their presence to feel alive. So do not explain your peace, do not apologize for your healing. This new life you are building, grounded, simple, free, is not a rejection of them. It is a return to you. And in that return, you model something even more powerful than devotion, dignity. And dignity, once reclaimed, can never again be taken. You once thought being a parent meant sacrificing everything, and you did. But now, with distance between you and the ones you raised, you must ask, was the sacrifice complete, or was it one-sided? Freud would say, the ego that sacrifices endlessly without acknowledgement becomes brittle, resentful, fragmented. And the only cure is reintegration. Not with them, with yourself. You are not a failure because they forgot. You are not unloved because they moved on. You are a being of immense emotional depth, navigating the aftermath of devotion. And it is here, in this very wreckage, that something sacred stirs. Freud called it sublimation, the act of transforming pain into beauty, grief into art, longing into wisdom. You may not have their visits, but you have your voice, and it is time to use it. Begin by telling the truth, not to them, to yourself. Say it aloud. I hurt, I hoped, I feel alone. And then, don't shrink from those words. Sit with them, honor them. Freud believed that healing begins with acknowledgement, not denial, not repression, but naked honesty. And from that honesty, a new identity can form, one that does not erase your past, but no longer bows to it. Because here's the secret. The more you reclaim yourself, the more they may begin to see you not as the old parent in the background, but as a soul in full bloom. Not because you begged for it, but because you stopped needing it. And nothing attracts like self-possession. Nothing inspires like quiet confidence. Nothing teaches better than an elder who lives in peace. So stop chasing. Stop waiting. Stop hoping that their presence will rescue you. Rescue yourself. Be the love you craved. Be the voice you silenced. Be the presence you longed for. Because when you become all that for yourself, you don't just heal. You transcend. You've spent a lifetime building others. Now it is time to build yourself. Not from scratch, but from what remains. From every scar. From every smile they forgot to return. From every moment you stayed silent so someone else could speak. Freud believed that maturity is not about having answers, but about asking better questions. So ask now, what do I want to do with the rest of this one wild sacred life? You are not too late. You are right on time. Because this moment of reckoning, of silence, of rediscovery, this is your invitation to step into the most honest version of yourself yet. The version that no longer performs, that no longer waits, that no longer begs. The version that stands tall, not because they returned, but because you did. You are not invisible. You are simply beginning again. Let the world see that. Let them witness the strength of someone who has faced absence and turned it into abundance. Let them feel the steadiness of your presence, not the desperate cry for attention, but the grounded knowing of your own worth. Freud would call this the individuation of the self, and it is rare, and it is holy, and it is yours. This story, your story, is not about what you lost. It is about what you reclaimed. It is not about the children who forgot. It is about the elder who remembered that love begins within, that healing is not a gift but a practice, that joy is not borrowed but born. So walk forward, not waiting, not hurting, but blooming. Because you, dear soul, are still very much alive. And the world is not finished with you yet. There is something profoundly beautiful about someone who has been forgotten and yet chooses to remember themselves. Throughout this journey, we walked through the silence that follows when children no longer call, no longer visit, no longer see. But perhaps what we truly discovered is that the absence of others often reveals the presence we've denied ourselves. Freud understood this as the liberation of the ego, the moment when the soul, no longer hostage to approval, begins to breathe on its own. And in this breath, life begins again. You are not a side character in someone else's story. You are the author of your own. And though your children may be absent from these chapters, that does not make them empty. It makes them yours. What once was pain has now become clarity. What once was longing has become transformation. You are no longer waiting to be remembered. You are remembering who you are, without scripts, without masks, without the ache of needing to be seen to believe you still exist. This is not just about your relationship with them. It is about your relationship with time, with meaning, with yourself. Freud believed that true maturity is the ability to hold conflicting truths, to grieve and to hope, to remember and to release, to love and to let go. And perhaps the greatest act of wisdom at this stage is not asking why they forgot you, but asking why you ever forgot that your soul was enough, entire, radiant, complete. So if today you feel alone, do not see it as a curse. See it as a clearing, a sacred space where something new can grow, because what you've just lived through, what you've just felt, is not abandonment. It is awakening. The kind of awakening that only happens when the noise fades and the truth begins to speak. And it says, you were never the silence. You were always the music they didn't hear. If this message touched you, don't let it end here. Share it with someone who might need to remember their own worth. Leave a comment not just for me, but for the version of you that finally found a voice. Subscribe not to follow a channel, but to walk alongside others who are choosing the same path of inner return. And above all, be the echo of what you just heard. Because somewhere out there, another soul waits in silence, hoping that someone like you reminds them they are not alone.